Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with the most annoying deck I've ever seen, Angus Mackenzie. I say that, of course, with love, because this deck aims to be the most annoying deck you've ever seen, and I would say succeeds pretty aggressively. This is a donation deck from Charit. Thank you so much, Charit, for supporting the channel. I am so impressed and frustrated at looking at this list. This is the exact kind of deck that I would like to play once and then probably never get a phone call from my friends again. There is a lot of power here and a lot of directions that the deck wants to go in. And with that latter note in mind, I do have some additions and changes I want to touch at. Otherwise, I think this is a perfectly good starting place for someone who wants to build a high power band control deck. As I think outside of CEDH power, this deck will control quite a bit of boards and quite a bit of play groups without much effort, or maybe with just enough effort. But before we go into this deck and why it's so annoying, let's take a look at the commander, let's see what we're working with, and then we can get into changes. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Angus Mackenzie and why are they our most annoying deck ever commander? Angus Mackenzie is green, white, blue, that's Bant colors, 2/2 legendary human cleric, with one ability. For green, white, blue, you tap Angus and you prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. This is a pretty decent middle of the ground control commander in most cases, but there's a lot of affections players have for Angus Mackenzie. Angus is, I believe, a cycle of one of the first legendary creatures where they were, and I could be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure these are created off of a series of D&D characters that Magic designers had. For that reason, they're all kind of weird. Angus Mackenzie is probably one of the less weird ones because there's no color pie breaks. That's the level of weirdness we're talking about. And a 3-mana 2/2 isn't the worst stats. Some of them, on the other hand, do have particularly worse stats. That being said, Angus Mackenzie I see often played in what is called Turbo Fog decks. Turbo Fog decks tend to try to use this ability Fog, which is the prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, over and over and over again. Now, Fog effects are things I don't particularly mind. I like a random Fog effect in a deck, I would say maybe half the time. Simply, Fog enables you to avoid lethal hits when you are least expecting it, or potentially to spend a turn where your opponents have spent a lot of resources to try to make a big move. Now, this could mean like a lethal swing against you and multiple players, but this could also be something such as, there's a lot of creatures that do effects on combat. I'm mainly thinking of ones that I'm trying to think of the pirate, the 5-mana pirate that says when you swing into an opponent and you deal damage to them, you get another combat step. There are a number of other extra combat steps as well, effects that I see a lot nowadays, and Fog being really effective to cancel the entire turn and cancel all these extra combat effects is really nice. This is not even saying the fact that a lot of these extra combat decks tend not to run blue and therefore do not have interaction against Fog or Fog abilities. So Angus allows you to have this Fog ability on your commander, and though 3 mana is overpaying for it, it is repeatable in the sense that you can do it once per turn cycle, or if you can untap Angus Mackenzie multiple times a turn cycle. Pretty powerful, but I would say niche nonetheless. However, much like a lot of commanders that I find in 3 colors that are generally mid-range powerful, I'm thinking of like Queen Marchesa and things like that, this allows for a number of different decks to be built out of it. And here we see Charit has built Angus Mackenzie as a very powerful control deck. Now, the last thing I'll touch on before we go more into this list is what a control deck is in Commander. I think a lot of times when we imagine control, we think of control decks as one would see in 60 card formats on one-on-one. So we think counter magic, we think efficient removal paired with slightly inefficient board clears. I said inefficient board clears that are made up for the fact that they provide immense card advantage, even though they cost more mana than you would pay for destroying a single creature. So with that in mind, we can see here that this is and has elements of that. However, in Commander, traditionally a control deck is built around more on locking your opponents out of the game rather than stopping everything they would do with counterspells. See, counterspells are a 1-for-1 trade, which is really, really nice when you have one opponent, but when you have 3 opponents, it becomes particularly difficult because you are going at a disadvantage in the long game, right? Though those 1-for-1 deals are particularly bad. If you want to be even in Commander, you need your cards to be 3-for-1 powerful, and a counterspell is rarely that. In fact, we often see counter magic as a way to protect yourself from combos and to protect your own combo that's going to win you the game. So once again, more in CDH, though, you know, some flavorful kind of control magic abilities, counter magic abilities, or hyper efficient ones such as Dispel that allow you to get ahead on mana and protect yourself on off turns are still played. So all that in mind, Angus Mackenzie is definitely more of a full-on control deck in Commander, where the main goal is not to cast counter magic, but instead stop your opponents from doing anything. Hence, the most annoying deck you've ever seen. Looking at the deck in general, as we always do, we see 36 lands with a number of ramp cards over here in sorceries that I particularly do like. We don't have any ramp artifacts. This deck is so powerful, we can see that Soul Ring is in the sideboard, so is Arcane Signet, but still I do particularly like the amount. 36 lands is perfect, and though we have some higher mana cards, and we will get back to those, we can see that the majority of the deck is low mana. We can especially see that when we look at the curve. The curve itself is mainly focused around 2 and 4 mana, which makes sense as a deck that attempts to shut down the game and the battlefield, which means a lot of our more powerful cards are going to be higher mana cost. We can see that 3 is lower than the rest of them, which is nice because 3 mana is our commander, and generally we do not want the slot our commander goes into to be completely filled. That being said, our commander isn't particularly high on our need to cast basis, so I wouldn't have particularly minded, I think I said particularly twice, I wouldn't have minded if 3 was a little higher. Then we trail off to a number of spells that are very, very powerful, of course landing at the end at Blightsteel Colossus at 12. Now, let's talk about the deck proper and what I would suggest that we change or we remove. Looking at the deck itself, we can see there's a lot of direct themes that are going on. A general theme of the deck is the importance of enchantments, and we've got a kind of soft enchantress theme going on, and I say soft because it seems more that this deck is built towards the power of these enchantments than the fact that they are enchantments themselves. And I prefer this. I think every theme is like a rule that is meant to be broken. Allow your theme decks to carry you as far as they can, and when the theme stops serving the purpose of the deck, you should stop serving the theme. And I think this is a pretty good example of that. There's a lot of really good Enchantress creatures here that work really well. All the Enchantress cards, Verdant, Mesa, Argothian, and I believe there is one that is an enchantment, but I can never remember what. Enchantress Presence, there we go. These are all just generally good cards in a deck that has at least 26 enchantments in it, which I do really, really like. But you would also note that this deck isn't running, for example, the 4 mana enchantment with Constellation from, I'm going to say, the first Theros block. And those are the kind of changes I really like, where, you know, I like these Enchantress effects, but I'm not necessarily going to be playing every single one, especially the ones that are overcosted for the ability. So all that is good. Whenever we break from the enchantment setup, it's because we have stronger cards that we want to play, such as cards like Esper Sentinel, such as Aura Thief, such as Oracle of Moldiah, Stoic Angel, Seedborn Muse, etc. With that in mind, after our Enchantress theme, we have quite a few finishers. And this is generally the thing I want to touch on the most. I believe this deck has too many finishers. Something it does have that could help this that I already really like is the high amount of tutors this deck runs. We've got Mystical Tutor, we've got Enlightened Tutor, we've got Worldly Tutor, not even including Idyllic Tutor, we've got Sylvan Tutor, we've got Sterling Grove. Our ability to find cards in our deck is actually really, really high. Something I really like in a deck of this power level in order to deal with our opponents, but also especially good in these kind of control decks. Because there are decks where there are games that you're going to need Stony Silence more than you need Rest in Peace. And the ability to switch between them using a tutor is really, really powerful. That being said, these could also be grabbing our win conditions, because at the moment we have quite a few win conditions. Blightsteel Colossus, though, is a creature that is a lot of fun, and I'm fairly certain was meant to be cheated into play, though I will admit at the moment I'm not sure how. Still an incredibly powerful card to get out there. There has to be some kind of reanimation that I'm missing. Regardless, very powerful card. But is this how we're going to win the game? For those who know these kind of decks a little better, you'll see also Helm of Obedience. Helm of Obedience will mill your opponent's entire deck if you have a Rest in Peace style card in play. Anything that stops your opponents from being able to put their cards in the graveyard, though I'm pretty sure the exception is Wheel of Sun and Moon, that ability will enable Helm of Obedience for 1 and tap to mill their entire deck. Now, the problem with Helm of Obedience is the fact that it requires you to mill out each of your opponents in turn, and once you mill your first opponents, the other two will work as hard as they can to mill or to defeat you, to stop you from milling them out. That might not be possible though, because you might be far enough ahead with your lock pieces and you should be able to win. I really like this. I think this should be the primary win condition of the deck. But at the same time, we can see we also have Helix Pinnacle, a very classic card that's there to, I don't know, put 100 mana into it and then win the game on your next upkeep. This is not good. I really, really don't like this card. And I think even in comparison to other backup plans, this is particularly bad. It just doesn't work with our plan, and all it does is paint a, target on your back. And it's not like it's going to take hate away from the other cards we're playing. Let me put it in a way that's direct. Imagine we have seen Seedborn Muse. Seedborn Muse represents untapping all of our lands and all of our creatures every turn. Seedborn Muse is particularly good here because it untaps our commander and the mana to use that ability every turn. So, if we have Seedborn Muse and Helix Pinnacle on the battlefield at the same time, the idea becomes, well, we're going to use what mana we need to in the turn, and whatever additional mana we're going to have, we're going to just feed it into the Helix Pinnacle. Hopefully, that's 6 mana per turn, that's 24 mana per turn cycle, that's 4 turns, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, and we'll be in the money and we'll win the game. Yeah, I think that that's not a really good plan, but even if you said, well, Helix Pinnacle, it's really good there, and people will be really paying attention. No, they won't. They'll be looking at the Seedborn Muse. The Seedborn Muse is the card in that combo that does something. And, I don't think this is a secret, Seedborn Muse is the card that does something every time it's on the battlefield. Nobody hangs around thinking, Seedborn Muse, that's just 3 times more mana than you usually have. No big deal, I'll leave that around. And nobody also says, well, now that you have Helix Pinnacle, now I'll care about the Seedborn Muse. No, if they have the option, they'll get rid of the Seedborn Muse. And I would say this is also indicative of any mana doubler or any mana propellant that would make Helix Pinnacle good. From Omnath to that enchantment creature that triples your mana, nobody's getting rid of Helix Pinnacle. They're getting rid of the enabler. And if you say, well, cursed, there you go. No one's going to ever see Helix Pinnacle coming, and therefore when I win with it, it'll be ever so sweet. And to that I have to say, sure. Sure. I don't even think I could be mad. I think Perhaps if Helix Pinnacle is winning often, maybe your opponents need to power up their decks a little bit. Looking a bit further, we've got another backup win condition such as Luminarch Ascension. Luminarch Ascension is a particularly strong card, but once again, it's competing with Helm of Obedience. It's competing with, if we see down here, Sigil of the Empty Throne. If we're looking down even further, it's competing with Divine Intervention. Let's get back to that in a moment. Yeah, it's competing with Opalescence. Opalescence. Yeah, it's Opalescence. So I know there's a bunch of combos for Opalescence, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But speaking of Luminarch Ascension and speaking of where's our Sigil of the Empty Throne, I do agree that one of these cards should be your backup plan. I just don't really think it should be... I'm going to say Sigil. I think, and I'll back that up a little later, I think Luminarch Ascension is going to be better. I think Luminarch Ascension works really well with cards such as Seedborn Muse, such as how your commander works by holding up mana, and it comes out earlier and turns on a bunch faster. And I think this will be much more powerful to start swinging out earlier in the game, taking out the most dangerous opponent you have faster, allowing you to lock out the other two and win at your own pace. So I would probably get rid of Sigil of the Empty Throne, and I would for sure get rid of Divine Intervention. I understand this is a card that that if 2 turns go by, the game is over and it is a draw. I get this is a very annoying thing to do, but I don't believe in drawing a game. I believe in winning a game. So I can't in good conscience say, play this card. I understand that you won't listen to me and you'll leave it in, but I have to say, don't play cards that don't win you the game. If you want to consider having this go off and drawing the game into a win, sure. No one else at the table will, but you can for sure. And I think that still counts, but I can't in good conscience tell you to play that. Another pseudo-win condition I want to point out is Elder Scale Worm. I know Elder Scale Worm does a little more than just, 7/7 trampling, but it's important to note that even then it is very, very high mana for a very specific ability that I think you have better ways to deal with. Something like in the sideboard here, we have Leyline of Sanctity. I think that would just be do a better job at this. And I think now a lot of days, anyone who has an infinite combo often has a way to clear the board or take out one troublesome creature. So it's more like this isn't going to stop them as much as being a bump in the road. And it's even possible that they can use the Elder Scale Worm as, I don't know, a reason to incite more attacks towards you while they set up to defeat you. If you had Elder Scale Worm and you were pretty locked down and I was a burn player, I would make deals with my opponents in order to get that worm off of the battlefield and then burn you out. And as a deck that already annoys your opponents, you don't want to encourage them even further to work together against you. But that's probably impossible at this point because everyone in the room hates you. All right, that's a few things that really caught my eye. There's a few other things that I think are worth pointing out or paying attention to. Ephemerate feels like considerably weaker than the rest of the cards you have in your instance, as you don't really have meaningful targets outside of Ewit. And even then, if that was the situation and you wanted that, I would still want a second copy of a spell like that. For example, the 4 mana in blue card that returns an instant, so that you can have 2 targets that will start buying you back cards, but I have better options to buy back those cards. Otherwise, I think this deck is doing really, really good, and just we've got too many win cons. I will say one more thing before we go into my additions, and that is Ghostly Prison and Propaganda. For those who've watched my channel for a while, thanks for watching, you'll know I have a sordid relationship with Propaganda and Ghostly Prison. These are cards I do like, and I do know that they're powerful, but I tend to not value as much. Here's the idea. The lower power level of your play group, the better these cards are. And by power level, I don't mean just deck power. I'm going to also say skill level. This card is a skill issue for many players. See, here's the thing. If you are playing this against this card and you do not think about it during main phase 1, you will find yourself on main phase 2 out of mana and not being able to attack this player. That can be frustrating to other players who may have been encouraging you to work together to take out the Ghostly Prison player, and it might be frustrating to you. This, of course, is something you can learn yourself out of, but every time it catches you like this, Ghostly Prison and Propaganda get better and better. However, the higher power of the player, the less likely this is going to catch them, and the higher power level of the deck, the less likely this is going to do anything at all. Because if you're playing against players that have Helm of Obedience level win conditions, that have infinite combos, Thassa's Oracle, burn spells, things that this deck is meant to stop, so therefore I have to assume is prepared against, then these cards get worse, and they get significantly worse. Now, I'm not saying that we should take them out, and I'm not even saying we should take both of them out, but I think we should be a bit more critical about these kinds of spells. If we were in a situation where we had a little more leeway or a little more information, I think these cards could be better. You might say, for example, against a token opponent, Ghostly Prison and Propaganda do a lot more work, especially if you can use things to goad all your opponents, or someone else is playing goad, where it becomes just impossible to attack you, and therefore they have to attack someone else. Even then, I would imagine the token player has Goblin Bombardment, or some kind of Aristocrats package, or some other form of direct damage that uses their tokens in a way because they know this kind of effect will take out their deck and they need a backup. Likewise, and I think this is where I'll end it on, what can these two cards do that a board clear cannot? And that to me is the biggest thing, because I generally prefer the board clear 100% of the time, and more often than not, I want to ensure that the problem is dealt with. This doesn't stop cards such as Thalia, such as opposing Esper Sentinels, that would do a lot against us because they are taking advantage of our high non-creature count. So I would just rather the board clear. And if you were to say, well, you know, the thing about the board clear, my opponents might be attacking each other in the meantime, that is a net good for me, I would say this isn't the kind of deck that wants to run this. This is the kind of deck that specifically wants to lock the game, prevent anything from happening, and in those situations, I'm just going to prefer the board clear. Finally, the last thing I did want to touch on before we go into additions, Approach of the Second Sun. This is a card you could play. I would probably take out one of the creatures. I would just play both the Helm of Obedience and Approach of the Second Sun as your win conditions as that. Approach of the Second Sun and waiting this 7 turns is vicious. It's an incredibly mean thing to do, and this deck can do it. So in my heart, I say, do it. That's so much fun. All right, let's go into the additions. So, first place I wanted to start is the Surveil lands. We are playing a very powerful deck. Surveil lands are so strong. I absolutely want to see you play them. I think you will benefit quite a bit from it. If you are at this power level, the deck says it's about 2,000. I don't know if that's necessarily the cost of it because of altars, but if you have the budget for this deck, or if you are proxying, definitely play these cards. They are so powerful. If you haven't had a chance to play a format where you can fetch into these, it's amazing. It is, you'll see them every single game and you will always be impressed with it. This also helps with the fact that certain mana costs such as 3 are not as even. So if you're going to cast another 2 mana spell on your 3rd turn, playing or fetch and playing one of these allows you to make the most of that turn despite not hitting what would be considered your maximum mana for the turn. All right, let's talk about Recursion. So the next few cards are going to be recursive, and by that I mean it's going to allow you to buy back some of the cards that you have. Now, what I like about your deck is the sheer singular power level of each of your enchantments. A lot of them are just so strong. From Stony Silence, Rest in Peace, to a number of others. Even things like Land Tax, hey, Helix Pinnacle, Sterling Grove, Sylvian Library. These are just really good cards, and your opponents are going to want to interact with them, and you're going to want to buy them back. Savine's Wreck is particularly good because, one, it gets back any 3 mana or less card, and that's really good, but also it flashes back to grab 2 of them. That, I think, is sometimes maybe more than you'd expect because you just might not have the opportunity to use that spell that way, but generally, on the main side, the fact that it can get any permanent is going to be particularly good. That means lands, that means creatures, that means Ewit, that means enchantments, and even, well, right now no artifacts because your only artifact is 4 mana, but should there come a time that you're playing Sol Ring, this can grab that too. I think that's particularly strong. Likewise, I'm pretty sure if we go down to March of Machine Aftermath, there was one more that I wanted to put here that I did not, which is Cosmic Rebirth. This one is likewise particularly strong. I think this works similarly with the bonus of it being instant speed. You pick a permanent, if it's 3 mana or less, it's on the battlefield, otherwise it's in your hand, and then you gain 3 life. This is the kind of card I think people very much so undervalue or underestimate, but the ability to throw back Rest in Peace or Stony Silence or anything like that at instant speed, very good, and can stop an entire turn if your opponents are just not prepared for it. Now, there's been a few times I've mentioned Rest in Peace with these cards that work with the graveyard. Just to clarify, for those who haven't played a deck of this power level, it is not a nombo once you get here. There is just you're just taking the L on cards like this, cards like Ewit, should you play Rest in Peace. If that feels bad, you have to remember the really high ceiling of the power of a card on Rest in Peace makes it so you don't particularly mind. Rest in Peace can shut down entire decks to entire strategies, to commanders even, and once that's in play, it becomes really powerful to protect. And since most removal will destroy it, Rest in Peace will go in the graveyard, it will turn these cards back on, enabling you to get back Rest in Peace, put it back into play. That's not even including the games where you don't care for Rest in Peace and you don't even play it, and therefore instead of having a few dead cards with a really strong card in the graveyard, you have 1 dead card and a bunch of strong cards to pull cards out of the graveyard. Another one here that I really like is Jailbreak. Once again, fans of the channel will know I love suggesting Jailbreak. Jailbreak is really good here. At this power level, it is put target fetch land into play, and it is ramp 1 opponent and you ramp yourself. Going back to how fetches work with Surveil lands, I think you're going to be particularly happy, but even then, this can be good enough to return a mana dork to someone and get a fetch land back. Some players, especially at lower power levels, will not get the full power of Jailbreak because they don't have fetch lands. This is a deck that will. And that's the floor. Just as said before, this will take any permanent out of your graveyard and put it on the battlefield, whether this be, more lock pieces or your win conditions or Helm. This can put you in a situation where you are buying back the best thing you have and giving your opponent a particularly medium piece onto their battlefield, not including the fact that there is politics there and you can give them something on purpose, telling them you'd give it for a favor and then get something out of it, which I think is very strong as well. That being said, I am starting to fear I'm approaching that moment where my opponents know that when I turn to them with a white deck, specifically my Brina black-white deck, and say, hey, how about I reanimate that for you? I think they're starting to catch on that it's Jailbreak, and if it's Jailbreak, I have picked them on purpose, and I've picked that permanent on purpose, and therefore if they say, I don't care, do what you want, it is the correct thing to do because I'm still going to reanimate it. So, note that. That is a way you can play around this card. With all the enchantments in mind, I am surprised that Sanctum Weaver is not in this deck. At the floor, Sanctum Weaver is just a Mana Dork for 2 mana that taps for any color. And I think that's fine considering the power level of the rest of the deck. However, this card really shines in the mid game where it can accelerate you with 4, maybe 5 mana. But even at this power level, I think you're generally happy if Sanctum Weaver taps for 2 sometimes, because that implies just another play you can play, another lock piece, or another activated ability that you can get off, such as Luminarch Ascension, sorry. And that can be really good, allowing you to buy another turn to get a little further and accelerate you. I do admit this is pretty bad in the late game top deck, but I mean, we're playing Kodama's Reach and the like. You got to take some L's somewhere. I didn't say this, but Cultivate and Kodama's Reach could be 1 mana enchantments such as Utopia Sprawl or Wild Growth, and then something like Sanctum Weaver gets a bit better. But I want to make sure you know I'm suggesting those for how efficient they are in mana and not that they're enchantments. We might get to the point that we have so many enchantments that our opponents start teching against us with, I think, Back to Nature or Opalescence or like any destroy all enchantment abilities that just will ruin our lives. But Sanctum Weaver, I think, is very much so worth leaning in a bit further. And leaning a bit further, we've gotten quite a few enchantment commander decks in the last little while, and though not all of them were at the same power level, there were definitely some banger cards in there. Composer of Spring specifically is one that really caught my eye, and one I don't see as often as I'd like. This is a 1/3 creature with Constellation, but is not itself an enchantment, and whenever you play an enchantment, you get to put a land card from your battlefield tapped. And if that's where the text ended, I would still suggest this card because it is very good. However, the text does continue and says if you have 6 or more enchantments, you can put a creature or land card from your hand on the battlefield tapped. I don't really think that second part of this sentence really or this ability really matters. I think more often than not, you're just going to get the first one, but I guess this can cheat in Blightsteel Colossus, so what am I talking about? That first ability I think is very good. Getting this deck into the mid game, I think it's one of its greatest weaknesses, because if you are just taking the first few turns off to slowly build your lock, you are very predictable and it is very easy to fight you on that level. Your opponent's direct removal will be the most effective when it is used on each piece. The thing about how your deck works is you want a number of pieces, lock pieces, to work in tandem, and so when we get to the situation where your opponents are just keeping that tandem from happening and keeping you on 1 lock piece a turn, you just won't be able to catch up, especially with the higher mana cost of some of the lock pieces. Composer of Spring, among other things, will not only ramp you to the higher lock pieces faster, it'll let you double spell early turns and enable you to yourself to be put in that situation where you can look at your opponents and go, what are you going to do now? Still, this also blocks is something else that I think is really good, and I do recommend this card. Ono Spirit Dancer is something I'm a little more unsure of, but I do particularly like. Ono Spirit Dancer is a enchantment doubler. However, it only does it once a turn. Now, a lot of people know how I feel about doublers, and I generally don't like doublers because I see them as a win more aspect of the deck. That being said, I never mind the first doubler, and this one I think is particularly strong because it's not a doubler we see often. To create a copy of an enchantment often requires a lot of work and requires usually copying tokens or populating or something like that. Like, you have to find a way to make this happen in a way it's not intended to happen. Whereas Ono Spirit Dancer by herself goes, hey, you got an enchantment? You now have an extra one. The ability to get that first trigger is really important because the enchantment does need to enter play, which means you need to cast Ono Spirit Dancer and an enchantment, and Ono Spirit Dancer has to survive that moment in order for the to see the enchantment. But you got to take that risk sometimes. I think if you have 7+ mana, that is a very good turn. And then if you ever untap with Ono Spirit Dancer, you're in a really good position because you get to cast one of your big spells and get away with it. That's not even including some kind of combo, such as like the Cosmic Rebirth or other ways of instantly putting permanents from your graveyard onto the battlefield, because Ono Spirit Dancer doesn't care where the enchantment comes from, just that it enters the battlefield. So in using some kind of instant speed ability to reanimate an enchantment on your opponent's turn will trigger Ono Spirit Dancer. So the ceiling on this card is really, really high, but the floor is kind of mid, which reminds me I'm going to skip to this card. Court of Vantress. Court of Vantress is close to what I like about that last card. Court of Vantress, of course, is a 2-mana enchantment that introduces the Monarch, and then on upkeep, you choose to one other target enchantment or artifact. It's going to be 99% time enchantment, but sometimes it'll be Helm. If you're the Monarch, you get a token copy. If you're not the Monarch, this enchantment becomes a copy of it, except it has this ability. Now, I really like this card. This card is at highest a doubler, let's say, but at its lowest, it's really, really good. Why is it good? Let's cover a few things. One, introducing the Monarch is always a powerful play for decks who know that they're going to do it, and it's always harder for your opponents who are not prepared for it. This is a fog deck. The only way you lose Monarch is by getting hit with combat damage. So of all the decks that can hold on to the Monarchy very well, this very much so is it. So not only are you going to be able to fog repeatedly, the extra card you draw to keep yourself in charge of the game is going to be very, very valuable. There's going to be turns that if you have 8 mana to play Court of Vantress and then cast Supreme Verdict, and that's it. You're guaranteed to have the cycle go, you draw a card then, and once it gets back to you, you have the more powerful ability, and you're probably way, way ahead, and unlikely for you to be losing Monarchy at any time. So that, very, very strong. On the floor, Court of Vantress becoming a copy of another enchantment is pretty decent. A lot of your enchantments are very, very good. Getting back to your turn and Court of Vantress becomes Smothering Tide, let's say, you're going to be very, very happy with that ability because, well, it's a really, really good one. Now, and this is really interesting. The second ability, let's say you have Monarch and you're going to make a copy of the Smothering Tide. That's already really, really good. But if you are alternating between being a Monarch and not being the Monarch, you keep Court of Vantress as what it is. This is really, really interesting because traditionally this kind of ability will say up until end of turn or up until your next turn. Court of Vantress never stops being something unless you want it to. So if you get it your first turn cycle, oh no, you got hit, you're going to make it a copy of, let's say, the Ghostly Prison, because you cut one out and you still want to. Now you have 2 Ghostly Prisons. You keep the Monarchy, and all of a sudden it gets back to you, and you're able to get a copy of something else. Let's say you played a better enchantment, or you want a second copy of something else. Cool. But Court of Vantress doesn't stop being Ghostly Prison. That just stays for as long as you are able to have this ability, which means until you're not the Monarch and you choose to change it, Court of Vantress will always be Ghostly Prison. And that's just insanely powerful. That's just a lot of doubling of your effects, both intended and not intended. So, talked a lot about this card. I think it's very, very strong. Obviously, this card gets a little better if you have ways to bounce permanents. So I'm thinking of any exile effect that hits, I think Flicker Fate is the one that comes to mind. That's 2 mana and you flicker a creature or you flicker an enchantment. That works on this. Flicker Wisp. A lot of these kind of abilities that target enchantments get better with Court of Vantress because it just buys you back the Monarchy if you've lost it and you're kind of stressing it on getting it back. So really, really strong. And I don't know if I would play both that and Ono Spirit Dancer, but I think they're both really strong and really fun to play with. Going back to the other cards I skipped over, Charit of Levy is a card that I've been enjoying. I'm still not 100% sure on its power level, but in a deck like this, I do really like the pressure it puts on 3 of your opponents. I say 3 of your opponents as if you would have more. Pressure on your opponents, and buys you a card, so it pays for itself, and gets you a land tapped, which is really, really good, especially with the Surveil lands, in order to pay for itself. But after that, it becomes a particularly good reanimation target, especially when you don't have something else you're looking to reanimate, so you can just keep playing it and just keep getting the effects over and over. Charit of Levy gets a lot better, in fact, also when you are playing cards like Seedborn Muse that allow you to make the most of your mana, but also this card is really, really good against counter magic because it pressures your opponents to think very, very carefully of the ordering of their spells. If they are going to spend a lot of mana in order to do something they don't want to spend mana on, in addition, by doing that, they might be giving you cards. The decision tree blossoms, and when your opponent's decision tree blossoms, that's good for you 90% of the time, because most people are not computers. If you give your opponent's decision paralysis, you'll be much more likely to take advantage of their mistakes. And Charit of Levy does that, especially on higher power levels, and especially if you keep bringing it back into play, annoying your opponents more and more to make them make more and more difficult decisions until they say, you know what, whatever, I'm going to pay the one, I'm going to cast my spells, I don't care if you get more mana and more cards, which is often exactly what you want. Because the difference, turn by turn, by having more fixed mana, more mana in total, and more cards, will allow you to take advantage of your opponents overcommitting into this. Destiny Spinner is a card that I saw was in your sideboard. It is a card I really, really like in a deck like this. It is just powerful to have the ability to say creatures and enchantment spells you control can't be countered. I just really, really like that that's done deal. A 2/3 for 3 is pretty strong, and that second ability is fine. I don't know how often you'll use it. Doesn't matter. It's fine. It's great. You love it. You want it to make it so your opponents, especially your opponent's blue player, the blue opponents, my goodness, cannot counter your lock pieces. So Destiny Spinner should be in here for sure. And obviously, she's an enchantment, which just works more with how your deck works. With that, those are my additions. I went a bit longer than I expected. I really, really like this deck, and I think there's a lot here that is really, really fun. I think if you tighten up the win conditions and aim it to be efficient, I know this is against the idea of the deck, but it would be less annoying to play with in a good way. There is annoying that I'm playing against you and you are beating me, and there's annoying I'm playing against you, you have stalled the game and you're never going to win. I prefer the former to the latter. I can be annoyed that my deck isn't beating yours. That's a skill issue. But if I'm annoyed that your deck doesn't have a win condition and I'm not going to concede, I guess that's also a skill issue on my part. What am I talking about? You're doing great. This is a great deck. Thank you so much, Shirok, for sending the deck. Happy deck building, and good luck. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.